If you think walking your dog is always a peaceful, uneventful activity, think again. Tonight, I'm sharing spine-chilling stories sent in by viewers just like you. Stories of ordinary dog walks that turned into something far from normal. From eerie strangers to unexplainable sounds, and paths that seem to lead nowhere. These tales will make you think twice before taking your next late-night stroll. So grab a blanket, keep your furry friend close, and let's dive into these true, terrifying accounts of what happens when the park turns into something sinister. It was close to midnight, the time when the world feels unnaturally still. I had been working late and didn't want my dog, Max, to miss his nightly walk. The park near my house was quiet at this hour, the kind of quiet that feels peaceful on most nights. But not this one. Max was a Labrador mix, normally calm and friendly. He loved this park. He'd bound ahead, sniffing every tree and chasing after rustling leaves. But tonight he seemed different. From the moment we stepped through the iron gates, he stuck close to my side, his ears twitching at every faint noise. The path wound through open fields and clusters of tall, shadowy trees. A few old streetlights lined the trail, but most of them flickered weakly, leaving long stretches in near darkness. As we walked deeper into the park, I noticed how unusually quiet it was. No insects chirping, no rustling of leaves in the breeze, just the crunch of my shoes on the gravel path and the faint jingle of Max's collar. About halfway through our usual route, Max stopped abruptly, his body stiff. His ears perked up, and he let out a low, guttural growl. I followed his gaze toward the tree line to our right, where the shadows seemed denser than they should have been. "Come on, Max," I whispered, tugging his leash. He didn't budge. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. My heart skipped a beat, but I tried to brush it off. Probably a raccoon or a stray cat, I told myself. But then the sound came again, closer this time. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. Silence answered me. Max growled again, louder this time, his gaze locked on the same spot. I squinted into the darkness, but all I could see were shifting shadows. My pulse quickened as I tugged harder on Max's leash. "Let's go," I said firmly. Reluctantly, he started walking again, but he kept glancing over his shoulder. I tried to shake off the unease settling over me, but then the footsteps began. They were soft, almost imperceptible, but they matched our pace. Whenever I stopped, they stopped. When I walked faster, they quickened. I told myself it was my imagination playing tricks on me, but Max's behavior said otherwise. His tail was down, and his ears flicked back and forth, listening. We rounded a bend in the trail, and I felt a small wave of relief when the playground came into view. The swing swayed gently in the breeze, or at least I thought it was the breeze. I glanced at the trees, but the branches were still. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the park seemed almost too still. I took my dog, Bella, out for her usual walk, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the park bathed in twilight. The street lamps flickered occasionally, their faint glow barely cutting through the growing darkness. Bella, a golden retriever with a usually cheerful disposition, seemed unusually hesitant as we entered the park. Her tail hung low, and she kept glancing around nervously. I chalked it up to the stillness of the evening. We were halfway through the trail when I saw him. A man, walking a large black dog, was heading toward us on the path. At first glance, he seemed normal enough, tall, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. His dog, a sleek Doberman, walked obediently at his side. But as we got closer, I noticed something odd. The man was smiling. Not a friendly, passing smile, but a wide, unsettling grin that didn't reach his eyes. His lips seemed almost too stretched, as if the smile was forced. "Evening," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Evening," he chirped back, his tone too cheerful, almost mocking. Bella stopped walking, planting her feet firmly on the ground. She let out a soft whimper, her eyes locked on the man and his dog. "Nice dog you've got there," the man said, his grin still plastered across his face. Thanks," I replied, uneasy. He stopped a few feet away, letting his dog sit. The Doberman was eerily silent, its eyes fixed on Bella. "What's her name?" the man asked. "Bella," I said cautiously. He laughed, loud and sudden, like I'd told the funniest joke he'd ever heard. "Bella," he repeated, his voice rising in pitch. Then, just as suddenly, his laughter stopped and his expression changed. The grin disappeared, replaced by a cold, empty stare. "You shouldn't be here," he said flatly. The air seemed to shift, growing heavier. Bella whimpered again, backing up slightly. "Excuse me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "You shouldn't be here," he repeated, his tone sharper this time. His grin returned, but it was somehow worse now, crooked and menacing. I glanced around, realizing we were completely alone. The park was silent, the distant hum of the city muffled, as if the world had closed in around us. "I think we'll just be on our way," I said, tugging gently on Bella's leash. The man stepped closer. "Do you hear it?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Hear what?" He tilted his head, listening to something I couldn't hear. His eyes darted around wildly, and he began muttering under his breath, words I couldn't understand. It sounded like a mix of gibberish and something foreign. Then he snapped his head back toward me, his grin gone again. "They're watching you, you know," he said, his voice trembling with something that sounded like excitement or fear. "Okay, have a good night," I said quickly, pulling Bella along. She resisted at first, her eyes still fixed on the man, but after a firm tug, she relented. We hadn't made it more than a few steps when he started laughing again, this time louder and more unhinged. "You can't leave," he shouted. "It's too late now." I spun around, my heart racing. He was standing perfectly still, his dog sitting calmly at his side, as if none of this was strange at all. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You'll see," he yelled, his grin stretching impossibly wide. Then, without warning, he turned and sprinted into the trees, his laughter echoing through the park. His dog didn't move. It sat there, staring at me with glowing eyes that seemed far too bright for the dim light. I blinked, and in that split second, the dog was gone. No sound of it running, no movement, just gone. Bella barked suddenly, yanking me back to reality. I didn't wait to see what else might happen. I ran, pulling Bella behind me as fast as I could. The path twisted and turned, but something felt off. I should have reached the exit by now, but it wasn't there. Instead, the trail seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me, looping back into the park. Panic set in as Bella began growling at something behind us. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, the sound of my own footsteps pounding in my ears. Finally, after what felt like hours, I burst out onto the main road. The park gates loomed ahead, their familiar iron bars a welcome sight. I didn't stop running until Bella and I were safely home. That night, I lay awake, replaying the encounter in my mind. Who was that man? Why had he acted so strangely? And why couldn't I find the exit? The next morning, I decided to walk back to the park in daylight, needing to assure myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But when I reached the spot where I'd met the man, there was no sign of him or his dog. The path seemed normal, the exit exactly where it should have been. The only thing out of place was a faint imprint in the dirt, shaped like a dog's paw, far larger than any dog I'd ever seen. I don't walk in that park anymore. Whatever I saw or met, that night wasn't just a stranger out for a stroll, and somehow, I don't think it was entirely human. It was one of those nights when the park felt almost deserted. I had finished work late and decided to take my dog, Milo, out for a quick walk before bed. Milo, a big, fluffy Bernese mountain dog, loved our nighttime strolls, and I liked the quiet. The park near my house was small and familiar, a loop trail with a playground on one side and a small pond on the other. We entered the park, and everything seemed normal. The air was crisp, the trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under my boots. Milo trotted happily ahead, his tail wagging as he sniffed every bush we passed. We had taken this trail dozens of times, so I wasn't paying much attention as we walked. But about 10 minutes in, something felt different. The path ahead looked longer than it should have been. Usually, the bend by the pond came into view by now, but all I could see was an endless stretch of gravel surrounded by tall trees. I frowned, slowing my pace. Did we miss the turn, Milo? I muttered, even though I knew that was impossible. The trail was a simple loop, no branches, no intersections. Milo stopped suddenly, his ears perked up. He stared straight ahead, his body tense. "What is it, buddy?" I asked, trying to follow his gaze. At first I saw nothing, just trees and shadows. But then, faintly, I heard it, a sound like someone walking just off the path. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The steps were deliberate, matching the rhythm of my own. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. The footsteps stopped. Milo growled softly, something he almost never did. His tail was stiff, his body rigid. I tugged on his leash. "Let's keep going." We walked faster, my pulse quickening with every step. But the path didn't feel right. It seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the trees on either side grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead until they almost blocked out the sky. The air grew colder, too, sharp and biting against my skin. I pulled my jacket tighter and glanced back over my shoulder. The entrance to the park was nowhere in sight, just an empty trail fading into the distance. Milo whined, his ears flattening against his head. Then up ahead, I saw it, a fork in the trail. There shouldn't have been a fork. The park only had one path. I stopped, staring at the split in disbelief. The left trail sloped gently downward, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. The right trail looked even darker, the gravel barely visible beneath a layer of fallen leaves. Milo barked sharply, startling me. He pulled toward the left path, his nose low to the ground, sniffing furiously. "Wait, Milo," I said, gripping the leash tighter. My instinct screamed at me not to take either path. But we couldn't just stand there. The wind picked up suddenly, rushing through the trees with a low, hollow sound. It carried a faint whisper, soft, indistinct, but unmistakably human. My heart pounded as I strained to hear. "This way." The voice was faint, almost melodic, drifting from the left path. Milo growled again, his fur bristling. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "We're going back," I said firmly, tugging on Milo's leash. But when I turned around, my stomach dropped. The trail behind us was gone. In its place was an unbroken line of trees, their twisted trunks packed tightly together like a wall. The path we had just walked on had disappeared completely. Milo barked again, louder this time, pulling against the leash with surprising strength. He wanted to go left. The whispering voice grew louder, more insistent. "Come closer." I shook my head, panic setting in. No way. I turned to the right path, even though it felt wrong. But as I took a step forward, the wind whipped around me violently, and the trees seemed to groan and creak. A shadow moved in the corner of my vision, tall, spindly, and too fast to be human. Milo barked furiously, lunging toward the left trail. His strength nearly pulled me off my feet. I had no choice but to follow him. As soon as we stepped onto the left path, the air grew deathly silent. Even Milo's barking stopped, replaced by an eerie quiet that made my ears ring. The only sound was our footsteps crunching on the gravel. The trail wound downward, deeper into the trees. I couldn't tell how long we walked, but it felt like hours. My legs ached, and the cold seemed to seep into my bones. I wanted to turn back, but every time I glanced behind me, all I saw was darkness. Then, finally, we emerged into a clearing. At first, I felt relief, until I realized the clearing wasn't empty. In the center stood a single tree, much larger and older than any of the others. Its gnarled branches twisted high into the sky, and its roots sprawled out like veins across the ground. Hanging from the lowest branch was a rope, swaying gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. Milo whined, backing up slightly. I wanted to leave, but my legs felt frozen in place. The whispering returned, louder now, coming from all directions. It was no longer a single voice. It sounded like a chorus, overlapping and frantic. "Join us, stay, don't leave." The shadows around the clearing shifted, moving closer. I couldn't see what they were, but I felt their presence, cold, oppressive, and watching. Milo barked again, snapping me out of my trance. I turned and ran, pulling him with me. The trail behind us reappeared as we ran, twisting and turning in impossible ways. I didn't stop until we burst out of the trees and into the open field near the park's entrance. The familiar iron gates were just ahead, glowing faintly in the streetlight. When we finally made it home, I locked the door and collapsed onto the couch, my heart still racing. Milo lay at my feet, his eyes fixed on the window, growling softly. The next day, I went back to the park during the day. I walked the trail again, searching for the fork, the clearing, or the massive tree. None of it was there. The trail was just as it always had been, a simple loop, no turns, no strange paths. But when I reached the spot where the fork should have been, Milo froze again, his ears pricked. That's when I saw it. A single rope, frayed and weathered, lying tangled in the bushes. I don't walk in that park anymore. I've always enjoyed taking Max, my golden retriever, for late-night walks. There's something calming about the quiet streets, the crisp night air, and the way the world feels like it belongs only to us for those brief moments. Last Thursday, though, our routine walk turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. It was around 10:30 p.m. when I grabbed Max's leash, and he wagged his tail excitedly. We live in a quiet suburban neighborhood surrounded by small woods and a few isolated houses. I decided we'd take our usual route, a loop around the neighborhood with a detour through the park. The night felt unusually still. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the typical hum of crickets was absent. Max trotted ahead, his nails clicking against the pavement, and I let my thoughts drift. As we reached the park, I noticed something odd. The streetlight near the entrance was flickering, casting long, jittery shadows over the path. I hesitated, but Max tugged at the leash, eager to continue. Reluctantly, I followed him onto the dimly lit trail. The park was eerily empty. The playground sat in silence, the swings motionless despite a faint breeze. Max suddenly stopped and sniffed the air, his ears perked. "What is it, buddy?" I whispered, kneeling to scratch his neck. He didn't respond, just stared into the dark expanse of trees lining the trail. I turned my flashlight on, illuminating the dense underbrush. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but Max's posture was rigid, his body on high alert. We continued walking, but my nerves were on edge. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart race. I tried to convince myself it was just the usual noises of the night, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. About halfway through the park, Max froze again, this time growling low in his throat. "Max, come on," I said, my voice trembling. I tugged his leash, but he didn't budge. His eyes were fixed on a spot ahead, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I followed his gaze and saw it, a figure standing motionless among the trees. My breath caught. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the shadows, but as I squinted, the figure became clearer. It was a person, tall and unnervingly still, their face obscured by the darkness. "Hello," I called out, hoping they'd respond and prove they were just a late-night jogger or another dog walker. The figure didn't move. Max barked sharply, and the sound echoed through the empty park. My pulse pounded in my ears as I took a step back. The figure suddenly shifted, not toward us but deeper into the woods, disappearing behind a cluster of trees. I should have turned around and left, but curiosity got the better of me. Keeping a tight grip on Max's leash, I stepped off the trail and pointed my flashlight toward where the figure had been. The beam caught glimpses of trees, bushes, and the faint shimmer of something metallic on the ground. I crouched to examine it, a small, rusty knife. The blade was smeared with something dark and sticky. My stomach churned as I stood up and scanned the area again. Then I heard it, a low, guttural sound, halfway between a growl and a moan. It was coming from deeper in the woods, and it was getting closer. Max barked again, pulling hard on his leash, desperate to get away. My instinct screamed at me to run, and this time I listened. We bolted back toward the trail, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear heavy footsteps behind us, crashing through the underbrush. "Come on, Max, faster," I urged, my voice barely audible over my labored breathing. As we neared the park's exit, the footsteps abruptly stopped. I risked a glance over my shoulder, but saw nothing. Just darkness and the swaying trees. We didn't stop running until we reached the safety of the main road. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, and Max pressed against my leg, his body trembling. I looked back one last time, half expecting to see the figure lurking at the edge of the park. But the path was empty, the flickering streetlight the only sign of movement. When we got home, I locked every door and window, double-checking them twice. Max curled up at my feet, his eyes darting nervously toward the front door. The next morning, I couldn't shake the events of the night before. I called the local police and reported what I'd seen, though I felt ridiculous trying to explain it. They promised to send someone to check the park, but I didn't hear back. That evening, I avoided our usual route, taking Max around the block instead. As we walked past the park, I noticed a police car parked near the entrance. 2 officers stood talking quietly, their faces grim. A shiver ran down my spine as one of them glanced in my direction and nodded. I don't know who or what I encountered that night, but I haven't set foot in that park since. Late night walks were usually my time to unwind. With Charlie, my scruffy little terrier, tugging excitedly at the leash, it was easy to forget the stresses of the day. Our neighborhood wasn't exactly bustling, but it was safe, and I liked the stillness after everyone else had gone to bed. That night felt no different at first. The cool breeze carried the scent of wet leaves from a recent rain, and the faint glow of the streetlights cast long, golden shadows over the quiet road. Charlie, as usual, darted ahead, sniffing at every mailbox and lamppost. We'd made it halfway down the block when I first noticed the van. It was parked on the corner under a dead streetlight, its black paint blending into the darkness. I didn't think much of it. Cars were always parked along the curb. But something about the van unsettled me. Maybe it was the way it sat there, utterly still, or the faint, almost imperceptible hum of its engine. I shook the feeling off and kept walking. A few minutes later, I turned onto a narrower street lined with older houses. I glanced over my shoulder, and my stomach tightened. The van was there again, crawling along behind us with its headlights off. "Come on, Charlie," I muttered, gripping the leash tighter. The street was unusually quiet, with no other cars or pedestrians in sight. I picked up the pace, listening intently to the faint rumble of the van's engine. It stayed behind us, moving slowly enough to keep its distance but close enough to be unnerving. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe the driver was lost or looking for an address. But when I turned left at the next intersection and the van followed, I couldn't ignore the cold knot forming in my stomach. The houses on this street were spaced farther apart, with overgrown bushes and dim porch lights casting deep shadows. My heart pounded as I glanced over my shoulder again. The van had stopped at the intersection, just sitting there like it was waiting. Charlie must have sensed my unease because he started whining softly, pressing closer to my leg. "It's okay, buddy," I whispered, though I didn't believe it myself. I needed to test something. At the next corner, I turned sharply into a small park with a walking path that looped back to the main road. The van couldn't follow us here. It was a dead end for vehicles. If it turned around and left, I'd know I was just being paranoid. But as we walked deeper into the park, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the van rolling across the grass. Instead, the street behind us remained empty, eerily still. Charlie barked suddenly, his body tense as he stared at the tree line ahead. My flashlight beam swept over the dark path, revealing nothing but swaying branches and scattered leaves. "Quiet, Charlie," I hissed, my voice barely audible over the rush of blood in my ears. That's when I heard it, a faint crunching sound like footsteps on gravel. I whipped around, heart hammering, and aimed the flashlight back the way we'd come. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I saw movement. A figure stepped out of the shadows, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. They were tall and broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like a hooded jacket. The light caught the faint glint of something metallic in their hand, a long, thin object that might have been a crowbar or a pipe. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The figure didn't answer. Instead, they took a slow, deliberate step forward. Panic surged through me. I yanked Charlie's leash and bolted, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The sound of footsteps quickened behind me, heavy and relentless, as if they were gaining ground. We burst out of the park onto the main road, and my heart sank. The van was parked at the curb, its engine still running. I froze for a split second, torn between running past it and doubling back toward the park. But then the driver's side door opened, and another figure stepped out, a wiry man with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. This wasn't a coincidence. They'd been following us. I didn't think. I just ran, dragging Charlie along as he barked frantically. We sprinted down the road, the van's engine roaring to life behind us. The headlights blazed on, flooding the street with harsh white light as the vehicle sped toward us. I veered onto a side street, my lungs burning as I searched for somewhere to hide. Up ahead, I spotted a house with its porch light on and bolted for it. The van screeched to a halt at the corner, and I heard the driver shouting something to the other man, but I didn't dare look back. Reaching the porch, I pounded on the door, yelling for help. Charlie barked beside me, his small body pressed against my leg. For a terrifying moment, I thought no one would answer. Then the porch light brightened, and an elderly man in a bathrobe opened the door, his face creased with confusion and concern. "Please," I gasped. "Someone's following us." He didn't hesitate. "Get inside." I stumbled through the door, just as the van's headlights swung onto the driveway. The old man locked the door and peered through the curtains. The van idled for a moment, its engine rumbling ominously, before reversing out of the driveway and disappearing down the street. I stayed at the man's house until the police arrived. They took my statement, but without a license plate or clear description of the men, there wasn't much they could do. They promised to patrol the area, but their reassurances felt hollow. For weeks after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I stopped walking Charlie after dark and made sure to always carry my phone. Even now, I can't pass a black van without feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. That night taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Sometimes, the quiet streets aren't as safe as they seem. And that's the end of tonight's chilling tale. Remember, the world can be full of shadows, both seen and unseen. And sometimes the most ordinary moments can hide extraordinary dangers. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Let me know in the comments. Have you ever experienced something strange or terrifying during a late-night walk? I'd love to hear your stories. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and keep your lights on. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep after this. See you in the next nightmare.